Good morning and welcome to this series on Othello by Shakespeare. This is the first video in the series where I'll be taking you through an introduction to the play, and then in subsequent videos we're going to look at a range of different topics including the key characters, and we'll also be doing scene by scene analysis. If you haven't watched one of these videos before, I really recommend that you take some notes as you're watching so you can remember the key ideas. And I've got an example of a really useful note-taking format here on the side of the screen. This is called the Cornell note-taking method, and the first thing you do is draw it out in your book. So pause the video, draw it out and then continue. Step one is to take bullet point notes as you're watching the video, so key ideas, words, quotations. Step two is for after you've watched the video, so go back through your notes and extract just the key words. So you'd maybe be reducing a page of notes to about 10 to 15 words. And then step three, again after the video, possibly the next day, is to use those keywords to write a summary of the topic. And this method really helps to embed your learning in your long-term memory. And it also helps you to focus on what's really important. So as I said, we're going to be looking at the key concepts today, and I've taken 6 ideas from the play that we're going to talk about. And in the next video, we're going to talk a little bit more about the plot and what actually happens in the text. I do warn you, there are spoilers, so if you don't want to know what happens at the end, then don't watch this. Go and watch a film version first or read it first. But it is a tragedy, so I think we all know what the conclusion of it is going to be. So the first key concept then, one of the most important, is the idea of ParaInstability versus powerlessness and instability. Now, I'm sure during your GCSEs, lots of you will have looked at the context of Shakespeare's plays. And some of you will know that Shakespeare staged Othello during the early 1600s. Now, this was just after the death of Queen Elizabeth I in 1603, and it was during the early reign of King James I. Seems straightforward, doesn't it? But Queen Elizabeth I ruled until her death in 1603, and she was known as the Virgin Queen. So she wasn't married and she didn't have any children. And because of that, her reign was troubled by questions of power. So firstly, could a woman rule as well as a man? You know, could an emotional woman with different biological needs and all of that rule as well as a man? Now, it's going to sound ridiculous to us today because of course they can, of course we can, but at the time it was a question that was much discussed. You know, would a woman be able to make a rational decision in a moment of stress? The second question that was discussed at the time was who would inherit the throne, and this was perhaps more important, I suppose, for the stability of the state. Because Elizabeth didn't have any children, that then meant that there was no obvious person who was going to inherit from her. So that would lead potentially to different people, a range of different people claiming the throne. That could then lead to civil war, civil unrest, conflict, or perhaps even England being broken up into different sections and different sections being ruled by different people. So for the stability and the unity of the country of England, it was really important that Elizabeth was able to have a clear heir to the throne. And obviously we know from history that that was James I, who had been King of Scotland, and then he brought Scotland and England together and he became king. And we didn't have that civil unrest, but it was still a question that was very much in the air at the time. Now, I'm looking at Othello and how it links to this. Othello opens in the city of Venice. At the time that the play was set, Venice was an Italian republic, which means it was ruled by a senate rather than a king or a queen. And it was known for its grandeur, its wealth, its cosmopolitanism. It was a seafaring city with strong military power. Now, that might sound kind of familiar. England was a seafaring nation. It was militarily strong at the time. In some senses, it was very wealthy in relation to some other countries, and it was becoming increasingly cosmopolitan as well. So there's quite a lot of parallels between Venice and between England. On the other hand, Venice was positioned on the fringes of Europe. It was in a precarious position because of that. And at the start of Othello, Venice's power is threatened by the Turkish invasion of Cyprus. And Cyprus was a Venetian outpost. Like England as well, Venice was a a colonising nation. It was sending people out to take control of other countries, and Cyprus was one of those outposts that Venice had. So one of the concerns in the play's opening scenes is who will lead the Venetian fleet in a battle against the Turkish forces. You know, that question, who's going to be the leader, seems kind of familiar to the English population who thought at the death of Queen Elizabeth, who's going to be our next leader? So there's a lot of connections here between the context that the original audience would have been living in and between the scene that we have at the very start of Othello. And in many ways, this kind of prompts the question, is the state of Venice or the state of England secure against other nations, and who should hold power, and what's the morality of the person who holds that power, and what is their responsibility? Is their responsibility primarily to themselves to gain more power, as we've seen happens in Macbeth with the tragic hero there, or is the responsibility towards securing the future of the people? I'm not giving any answers to these questions, I'm just suggesting things that Shakespeare was considering and exploring in his plays. The second key concept then that's clear from the very start of the play is the idea of racism. Now, there's a lot of things that are said in Othello which are absolutely abhorrent, and I just want to make that clear from the very start. A character called Iago, also Rodrigo and Brabantio say some deeply offensive comments about the main character Othello. And like many of Shakespeare's tragedies, the eponymous hero, Othello, does not appear on stage in the opening scene. So we've seen in Macbeth, for example, Macbeth is described in the opening two scenes, but he doesn't appear on stage until Act 1, Scene 3. And what this allows Shakespeare to do is to establish the context within which the hero will operate. So for Macbeth, that context is one of hypermasculinity, and Macbeth is built up as this great military leader, this hero who's able to slay hundreds of people on the battlefield, who's courageous, who's brave, but also who's maybe a little bit too violent, who maybe gets carried away by the bloodlust. And for Othello, what Shakespeare uses the opening scene to show is the racism of Venetian society. So the first characters who come on stage are Iago and Rodrigo. Now, Iago is Othello's ensign, his servant in the army, and he speaks very derogatively about his leader. He dehumanises him and he complains about Othello's marriage to Desdemona. And what we learn very quickly in this opening scene is that Iago's problem with the marriage is that Othello is black and Desdemona is white, and they've eloped together. And Iago discusses this with his kind of sidekick, his dupe, Rodrigo, and they go together to the house where Desdemona lived previously, before she eloped with Othello, and they waken up her father, Brabantio. And they tell him about the marriage, and Brabantio responds in kind of similarly racist tones. So this scene is very difficult to watch as a kind of modern viewer, but what Shakespeare's doing is he's trying to establish the racism that Othello is up against in the play. But when Othello enters in scene 2, he's presented completely differently. So he's presented as rational, as honourable, as articulate, and this is a far cry from the base character that we heard Iago speak about in scene 1. So Shakespeare in scene 1 is setting up a racist stereotype, and then in scene 2 he's demolishing it, allowing the audience to question Iago's honesty from the outset. And in a wider sense, Shakespeare arguably prompts his Renaissance audience to question their own preconceptions. The audience who would have been watching this would have been very familiar with the idea that Queen Elizabeth had written in law that she wanted people who were black to be taken out of England. She didn't want them to live in England, and so the audience themselves would have had a lot of racist beliefs and ideas, and that ideology would have been very much in circulation at the time. And so in scene 2, when we see Othello come on the stage and we hear him speak, the first thing that we hear him say is he's telling Iago to calm down, not to kill someone, just to take things rationally rather than being carried away by emotion. And that might have been quite surprising to the audience at the time. And so one of the things we can debate when we're studying the play is, was Shakespeare opposing racism? Certainly in these opening scenes, it does seem that he does do that. However, later in the play, Othello internalises these racist beliefs. So he's told so many times that he should behave in a certain way and he should have a certain kind of character that he almost starts acting that kind of character out. And possibly, here's a spoiler, we could ask, is that why he murders Desdemona in the end? Does he commit this act because he's come to believe what others say about him? And so if we go along that line of discussion, it could be posited that Shakespeare is exploring the detrimental impact of racism on its victims. And so society is the true villain of the piece, and Iago is the mouthpiece of society in voicing those racist ideas. Another key concept that we need to consider is that of gender roles in the play, and I've already mentioned Queen Elizabeth I. Now, she, I suppose at the time, symbolised these ideas about power and authority that women should have. So she represented this idea that a woman could be the most powerful person in England. But on the other hand, there was an idea that actually men and women should inhabit different spheres, and that biologically they were created to have different roles. And this is very much supported by religious concepts at the time, that men have kind of political understanding, intellectual thought, economic thought, and that they should go out and do the work and that they should be making the decisions, and that within this patriarchal society, women are somehow lesser and they're less able to understand intellectual discussions. Now, Elizabeth I absolutely destroyed that idea, but I suppose the discussion at the time was very much, you know, Elizabeth I is being chosen by God through the divine right of kings, and she's somehow special, she's different from other women, therefore she can be the queen, but maybe other women don't quite have that ability. So these stereotypes were kind of almost shifting, almost changing, but at the same time there was a reaction against that as well. And in Othello, we see female characters as being depicted as having differing amounts of power and agency. And this changes throughout the play depending on their relationships with the male characters. So initially, Desdemona is very determined, she's confident, she's articulate. She comes on stage in Act 1, Scene 3, defying her father. She speaks in front of a whole senate of people who are in charge of Venice and says that she's going to stay married to Othello. And then, when it becomes clear that Othello is going to go with the fleet to fight the Turkish army, Desdemona says that she's going to go too. You know, very courageous for a woman at the time, both socially, in terms of speaking in an entirely male environment, and also saying that she's going to join the army in this. However, she gradually loses power as the play progresses, and the audience is left wondering if the silencing of women is inevitable, or if this Desdemona's death is some kind of punishment for being so outspoken at the beginning of the play. Another key concept to consider when you're looking at the play is the power of language. Now, it might be surprising that in a play with so many soldiers that the main battleground doesn't involve weapons. It's not a battle. It's not a play really about political power, or explicitly about political power. Rather, Othello is a play in which language is used to impose power and to maintain control over others in quite a personal way. So in Act 1, Scene 1, Iago, who I've already spoken about, uses language to manipulate his dupe Rodrigo and to poison Brabantio's mind. And then in Act 1, Scenes 2 and 3, Othello uses rhetoric to persuade his listeners to agree with his marriage to Desdemona. So in the first three scenes, we see that language is clearly established as a tool for persuasion. It is not neutral, and both Iago and Othello use language very effectively to get their way, essentially. And then as the play progresses, language is used for increasingly malignant ends. So Iago gradually drip feeds these ideas to Othello, suggesting to Othello that his new wife Desdemona is having an affair. And those words that Iago uses to make those suggestions are incredibly powerful, and we see their very destructive effects at the end of the play. Language is also a barrier between people, so Othello and Desdemona are unable to communicate effectively. At one point they have a conversation where Othello and Desdemona are using the same words, handkerchief, but they actually mean very, very different things, and we'll look at the significance of that word handkerchief in a subsequent video. But on the other hand, Emilia's use of language towards the end of the play implies that words can be used more positively to argue for women's rights. So language is quite a vexed issue in the play. And Shakespeare uses these characters to explore the power of language, revealing the fact that language is never a neutral medium, but is employed by the speaker to achieve their own ends. Okay, the next idea then in the play is the battle within. So the battle within the mind rather than an external physical battle. So just as language replaces the battlefield as the main point of conflict in the play, so too does the psychological state of the individual characters. As Iago's lies and his dishonest suggestions about Desdemona's alleged affair poison Othello's mind, the tragic hero's former psychological stability descends into chaos. And it's really interesting to look at how Shakespeare depicts the impact of trauma on the mind. And what we see is the breakdown of Othello's language. So he stops being able to speak in full sentences. He's repeating ideas. He's obsessing over particular things. And he also loses control of his body as well. So he has an epileptic fit at one point of the play. And all of this is the impact of the mind on the way he's speaking, the way he's interacting, but also on his physical existence as well. And it shows the extent to which the individual can be pushed by the language that others are using. And the staging of the gradual unravelling of Othello's mind prompts the audience to consider the extent to which irrational thoughts, so those emotions of jealousy and anger, are able to dominate our rational control of ourselves. And I think we all know how powerful things like jealousy are. You know, there's not necessarily any concrete proof or any rational reason to feel jealous of somebody. However, it can become a little bit overwhelming. And finally, we're going to look at the concept of the transgression of social boundaries. And I suppose this idea kind of sums up everything that I've been talking about. So if you were to list the boundaries in the play, the list would almost be endless. You've got the separation of men and women into their separate spheres. You've got the separation of Venice in Europe and Cyprus kind of on the border between Europe and Asia. You've got discussion about upper class characters and middle class characters and who should be in which class. You've got the boundary between morality and immorality. You've got different ethnicities and so on. And what's really interesting about the play is how when characters exist at these boundary points, they often become quite blurred. So if you look at morality and immorality, for example, at one point Iago says that nothing he's doing is actually immoral, because all he's doing is speaking to Othello and saying, you know, your wife might be having an affair. You know, in Iago's head, I suppose, what's wrong with that? You know, it's a reasonable thing to say. And so that boundary between morality and immorality becomes blurred. And then for Othello at the end of the play, we see that he so believes that Desdemona needs to be punished, that he kills her, but he believes that killing her is an act of morality, it's an act of justice. So the different groups become quite confused in the play, and these boundaries are transgressed. And there are varying consequences for the transgression of boundaries as well. So there are moments of hope in the play. So that moment when Desdemona insists in front of the senators that she's going to stay married to Othello, or that moment when Emilia insists that men and women have the same rights and needs, both of these are moments of hope in the play where you can look and think, actually, we could destroy that boundary, we could transgress that boundary and improve society. However, the tragic ending of the play seems to suggest that the price people pay for transgression is their life. So both Desdemona and Emilia, characters who cross these boundaries, both of them end up dead at the end of the play. Ultimately, what Shakespeare presents us is a world on the brink of change for the better. So Emilia vocalising the rights of women, you know, this presents us with new possibilities for an improved world. Or Desdemona and Othello's marriage, you know, presents us with the possibility that different races can live in harmony. But what Shakespeare also shows us is that in 1603, a lot is needed to change for such freedoms to be possible. And so the play is a real challenge to the audience. What type of world do you want to live in? Do you want to live in a world in which traditional boundaries and systems are maintained, or one in which transgressing or destroying these boundaries will lead to liberation and not destruction? And one of the questions that people always ask me in school is, why are we studying the writings of someone who's been dead for 400 years? And actually, when we think about these questions, we can see what the value of Shakespeare is. You know, there's still a challenge for us there. What type of world do we want to live in? What kind of boundaries still exist? And how do we want to change those boundaries and destroy those boundaries so that we can live in a much better society? So that's just a little bit of an introduction to the play, and in the next video we're going to look at the plot and the characters of the play so that we can start to drill down into the specifics. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope to see you next time.